About 90% of the remains are mammoth and about 10% are mastodon, but we use the name interchangeably. We didn't know the difference. Mastodons are earlier and their tusks are shaped a little different and they have a tighter grain, and it's real desirable now because it's has more stability than mammoth. Mammoth tends to dry out and crack and fall apart after you get it out of the river or out of the ground. So we really like mastodon, but it's hard to get.
Got Terry Williams here. Terry, I'm glad you came in.
Thank you. Good to see you, Mark.
Yeah, how long have we known each other? I was just trying to figure
I
that
think
out.
almost 40 years.
Oh, God, it can't be. Is it really?
Yeah,
Oh,
when we used to do the Indian art shows.
Uh-huh.
I always see you collecting the best baskets ahead of me.
Yeah, well, we at the beginning of 40 years, I can assure you they weren't the best basket. They're the ones I could afford, probably.
Yeah, we were both in that category.
Yeah, it's funny, you do a podcast like this, and I've known you 40 years, but I don't really know the backstory at all. So I want to find out the backstory. So where did you grow up, Terry?
Oh, I grew up in Seattle, and I was invited to Alaska to be a resident artist for a gallery there, and that's how I ended up in Alaska.
So let's just start with Seattle. So you grew up in Seattle. What did your mom and dad do?
Oh, my mom was a dental assistant, and
Uh-huh.
then when she had a couple of kids, she became a full-time house mother. And my father was a civil engineer, and he worked for the city engineering department.
And
So,
did you have brothers and sisters?
yeah, to my mother's aggravation, I had only brothers, and she always wanted a daughter. So she was pretty happy when we had a daughter.
Uh-huh. And how many brothers do you have?
2 brothers.
Uh-huh. So you grow up in Seattle.
Yes.
And what time frame was this? Is this like the
The 60s
Early
and
60s?
early 70s, I moved to Whidbey Island, which is on Puget
you
Sound.
keep wanting to go up there, but I'm not letting you get that far that fast. I
Okay,
want to
yeah.
find more out about Seattle.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So did you have an interest in art or Native American art when you were a kid?
It's interesting because when I look back at it, even in grade school, I was making masks inspired by Indian art, like paper mache masks, and painting them with rainbow colors and stuff. And my art teachers thought I was pretty interesting. And I was really lucky. My parents chose our neighborhood because we had the best schools in Seattle, which was one of the best school districts.
Mm-hmm.
And we had some really professional quality artists for art teachers, and also professional musicians for band director and stuff. And I focused mostly on music and art.
So they would allow you to actually focus and take more classes in music and art in high school?
Yeah, I tended to be an overachiever, and I had a high GPA. And by the time I was in high school, I had as many as 5 independent classes per day. So I
Wow.
barely had to show up for school.
And those independent classes were all art related?
Yeah, and science. I did research, collecting ferns and mosses and all the sort of things nature boys do.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a great childhood. I was really lucky. Grew up in really good schools, and my best friend was a bug collector, and
Mm-hmm.
we used to do a lot of insect-related things and artwork about nature.
Mm-hmm. What were you doing? Drawing and painting, or
Drawing mostly, yeah, and some painting.
did you know
Um,
Bill Gates by any chance? Was he in that
He
system?
was in our Cub Scouts.
He was,
Yeah,
really?
he lived only a few blocks away. We lived on the other side of the tracks. Our neighborhood was real middle class, university professors and stuff, but on his side of the valley was a lot of the important business owners, and he obviously got into computers at an early age. At that age, I thought computers were the weirdest, geekiest thing you could do, and I never wanted to get around them. But he really made a business of it, obviously.
Yeah, so he was actually in your Cub Scout group?
Yeah. He was a couple of years younger. He was actually closer to my brother's age,
Uh-huh.
and my brother still remembers him pretty clearly.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, that was a really interesting time to grow up in Seattle.
Yeah, it sounds like it from just what I read of, on Bill Gates and how they had computers and things that other people didn't have. So you had that opportunity, but it just wasn't your thing.
Yeah, the computer class was only about a half dozen guys. They're probably all billionaires now. But, not too many kids were interested in that at that stage. So I was more interested in artwork already.
And so when you graduated high school, what year was that?
69.
Okay, so you're graduating right in the first draw of the Vietnam War for the
Yes, that
lottery.
was a close call. I got a number, a draft lottery number that would have required me to go, but I was able to go to university with a education deferment.
What was your number? Do you remember?
132.
Oh, yeah, that's a goer.
Yeah, and then what happened is right at the end of my university career, they decided to only call up to 125. And I dropped out of school and I was available for 2 months, and that was the end of my availability. It was a catch-22. I learned from my father that if you dropped your deferment, you would only be available for the rest of that year. But then right after that, Nixon ended the war. So
Yeah.
I was lucky not to go. I have many friends that went.
Yeah, and did some of them not make it back?
Some of them not, and most of them are ill now from being exposed to Agent Orange and other carcinogenics.
Do you remember sitting around that night when they did the pull, when they did pulling out the blue pills of the numbers?
Yeah, I actually was at a party and I drank so much I barely drove home. It was really a hazardous drive back to my parents' house.
Yeah.
I was pretty worried about having to go.
Yeah. So when you went into college, you were an art major?
I changed majors almost every semester. I started in pre-med and I got to biochemistry, and I decided that I wasn't going to be a doctor because biochemistry was over the top for me.
Uh-huh.
And then I went back to playing music. I was trained to be a professional classical musician
And what instrument?
on the trumpet.
Uh-huh.
And I did that for a little while, and I realized that I wasn't probably going to make a living doing that. Most musicians, you either have to be a rock star or you're a school teacher, and then you have to be used to humble income and lifestyle. So I switched to art, and I really got into it, and I really took off. And within a couple of years, I was self-employed as a silversmith and a graphics artist.
So were you collecting Indian art yet at this point in time?
My father was a stone artifact collector, and so was my grandfather. So you and I have that in common, that it ran in our families.
Yeah. So did they collect lithics like axes and arrowheads and things like
all
that? And
sort
did you
of
go
thing.
collect those as a kid with them?
Yes, that's interesting you would ask about that, because some of the most fun things we did as children is collecting arrowheads and trade beads on the Columbia River before it was dammed up. In the 50s, the Columbia River had very few dams. I think Grand Coulee was one of the few. And it wasn't such a breadbasket. It wasn't such an agricultural area. And in the late 50s and 60s, they started building the dams that provided irrigation to all of eastern Washington. And then it became one of the biggest apple exporters in the world. But in those days, you could just walk around on gravel bars and sandbars on the Columbia River, especially around Vantage, which is right in the middle of eastern Washington, and pick up beads and arrowheads. And my dad had screens, and we used to run the sand through screens, and you could get quite a few arrowheads. When he retired from collecting stones, my father had 50 frames of arrowheads, Columbia River arrowheads.
And beads, tell people about the beads, because a lot of people wouldn't understand what a trade bead was and how would it end up in the river and the
Yeah, there was a few ones that were imported, made out of glass. But mostly they had what we called wampum, which was little shell beads that they made probably with drill bows.
themselves.
Yeah. And they must have had zillions of them because they were like some percentage of the sand. And if you crawled around, you could see them and just pick them up. And that was something I enjoyed doing. One of the reasons there was so much archaeological remains and evidence there is before I guess it was the measles epidemic that wiped out the natives in eastern Washington. There's 150,000 natives living on the Columbia River, and probably most of their graves were, near the river and in the sandbars, and most of the villages were right on the river because most of their food came from salmon runs, and
Mm-hmm.
they were big fishermen. And then when they built the dams, unfortunately, it covered all the evidence, archaeological evidence. So
And which Native American groups would have been in there?
most of them are now in northeastern Washington, and you have the Nez Perce is one of the big ones, and Yakima
Yeah.
was a big one. There was quite a few. They were what we call inland Salish,
Mm-hmm.
and they did their material culture was real similar to the coast. Their baskets for interest were very similar to the cedar root baskets on the coast.
And so you started collecting with your dad, and you developed your own collection. Do you still have that collection of beads and lithics and things?
A lot of them got lost when the state got broke up. I inherited the stone artifacts from my father, and I traded and shared them with people, and I still have some of them.
Uh-huh.
And it was really interesting when I found out when we were doing genealogy about my grandma's family that we had native traders all the way back to Quebec in the old days. So I guess that interest ran in our family for generations.
Yeah.
Lucky for me, I really made my life around it.
Yeah, but at the time you were in college, you really weren't considering buying and selling Native American art or doing that as a living?
My goal was to be a rock star like the Rolling Stones.
The trumpet guy.
Yeah.
And then that didn't work out, and you moved into the art field. And were you getting a degree in art?
No, I was more interested in being professional artist, and that's when I realized I had a jewelry shop. I started at the Pike Place Market in Seattle. I was one of the first 3 silversmiths at the Pike Place Market.
What year was this?
That was in the 69, early 70s.
So right then, the Native American craze was really kind of going for jewelry, right?
Yeah, and it was fascinating, the history of the market, because it was previously a farmer's market, and Seattle was growing in leaps and bounds, and it became King County, the county that Seattle's in, was a real breadbasket. And then around that time, the growth and the industry got so big, there was no more farmers in King County. And about the only people that still sell agricultural stuff at the Pike Place Market are people that grow flowers, and they're recent immigrants. And what happened was all the day tables where the farmers used to bring their produce slowly started turning into arts and crafts. And I was lucky enough to be one of the first 3 silversmiths to sell silverwork at the public market. And it was a great opportunity for learning a career.
This is 1970?
Yeah, early.
So you're like 19.
Yeah, I was really young. And in those days, you could live in downtown Seattle. I had what I called a penthouse in a tenement that was $35 a month, and it had a beautiful view of downtown, and I could pay for my rent for a whole month by selling silverwork at the day tables at the market.
And so you're making bracelets and things like this?
Yeah, and rings and pendants.
And were they Indian style, Native American style, or what were they?
A friend of mine gave me an early issue of Arizona Highways that had all the early pawn jewelry, turquoise jewelry, and I started copying that stuff. And I took a couple semesters of jewelry classes, and because of the market and because of my exposure to the turquoise jewelry, I immediately became successful enough to support myself,
Mm-hmm.
something I never quite managed as a musician.
Yeah.
And that was a real lucky turn of events. And I figured out by setting up 3 days a week during the holidays, I could save enough money to travel around the world after New Year's. And I started going to Latin America and South America and eventually to Asia.
So you dropped out of school.
Yeah, when the war was over, my university career was done.
And that was directly related to, okay, I'm safe now?
Yeah, I was ready to be self-employed as an artist. And I became pretty successful for an artist.
And how long did you do that, make silver?
Well,
Silver
still kind of doing it, but I did it for probably about 30 years, but it became a really big deal when I got invited to Alaska.
Uh-huh. So, but before you go to Alaska, so do you go down to, where all do you go? You go to Mexico or Central America and these places?
Yes, I spent 5 months in Latin America. I went for 5 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
and I just had so much fun. I stayed for 5 months, and I came home, and everything that was in my apartment got distributed to my friends, and everybody thought I died and was never coming back. So they were pretty surprised to see me again. And I collected artifacts down there. My interest in stone and other prehistoric artifacts turned towards Latin America, and I collected that sort of.
And were you buying and
material.
selling this material at this time, or just collecting it?
I was mostly buying and selling textiles from South America and keeping the artifacts.
Uh-huh. So like Bolivian textiles and things like that?
Yeah, people were, in those days, wearing ethnic clothes was the height of vogue, and we could bring back, weepiels and various costumes and bags, shoulder bags.
And were these old clothes or new clothes, or both?
I like to specialize in antique ones because they were way better quality and more collectible. They were still really inexpensive in those days. Now they're quite valuable, as you know.
Yeah. So you do that for 5 months. You're down in Central America, and then you come back. Did you ever get any of your clothes and things back from your friends when you showed up?
No, the sad part was as I collected books, my father used to give me a blank check at the beginning of every semester of university, and I could go to a university bookstore and buy any book I wanted. He thought I was buying books for my classes, but I was buying books on every imaginable thing. I had very eclectic interests. I had a really good library of ethnographic books and religious books. I was amateur, religious student, and all of them got distributed. Some of them floated back, but I think most people that got them probably made better use of them than I did.
And either reading them and selling them, and
Yeah,
something.
both. Yeah. So that was pretty good.
So you come back from Central America, and you're selling silver. You're making silver. You're selling these textiles, and you're in your mid-20s at this time.
Yeah.
And so then what happens?
I got invited by another silversmith from the public market to share a shop on Queen Anne Hill. And we had this little shop in kind of a neighborhood strip mall, and it became pretty popular and pretty well known.
What was the name of that shop?
Well, it was our names. His name was Charlie Anders and mine was Terry Williams, and we just had our names on it. He became pretty well known because he was a coppersmith, which was a really rare thing, and he was also a really good cook. And professional cooks used to come and buy copper pans from him and have him restore his copper pans. So in a little bit, I rode on his coattails, but then we both became too big to share the same shop, and I moved next door, and then I had my own shop. And I had that shop for about 3 years, and something fairly horrible happened, but it turned into a good turn of events. My shop was broken into, and I lost all my South American artifacts in a theft and in a burglary. And I decided that I didn't want to live in the center of town anymore. And that's when I moved to the islands in Puget Sound and became a recluse and really got into doing my own work. And I really improved in leaps and bounds when I wasn't running a shop.
So when you say a recluse, were you literally out in the back where no one, I mean, no electricity, running water, or?
I had power but no water. I was in an old cabin in the woods near the beach, and we lived mostly for the first couple of years fishing and digging clams and gleaning orchards.
You
And
said we. Did you have a wife or a girlfriend?
yeah, I had a girlfriend who eventually became my wife, and she's an artist now too. And it was pretty fun. I enjoyed it. But then there was a point when we started having children and we realized we needed a place that was less primitive. But the amazing thing was for me that I only went to town once a week, so I was totally focused on doing my artwork and improving my artwork. And I realized I was getting pretty good pretty fast. And there was times when I felt like I was almost channeling historic artists or something, because it was almost like the work was improving at a rate that was inexplicable. It was exciting times.
And and at this time you're digging clams. Are you growing your own food too as well?
Oh, I was in deep woods, and we were surrounded by old growth trees, and it meant we could heat with wood, and we had a wood cook stove.
Uh-huh.
Everything was wood related, which is traditional for that part of the world. And that was pretty fun. It's like going back in time or something.
Yeah. You did that for 3 years?
Yeah, and then my wife decided we were moving to downtown Coupeville, and we became residents of historic town, not unlike the one I live in now.
And did you have a child by that time when you moved?
Yeah, my son came, and then we thought we were done, and then a couple of years later we had a daughter. So, and then we had a match set, and that was enough. Had to slow down after that.
And so when you're living out in these woods by yourself and your wife, and you're basically growing or gathering your food, but you're making your art, you're doing just silversmith, you're making jewelry.
Mm-hmm.
Would you go in and sell this, I mean, once a week to the townspeople, or how did you get
right.
sales? You still need
I
money.
knew the best galleries in Seattle from my previous career, and I could just go once a week to Seattle and sell what I produced for the week and raise enough money to go home and live comfortably.
Was it still Indian style jewelry?
Yeah. In fact, it took a turn towards Northwest, and I started doing less Southwest style. And the market was fairly flooded in the 70s. It was going real well, but there was lots of good stuff, and it was getting harder to compete. And somebody gave me the Bill Holm book called Northwest Coast Indian Art and Analysis of Form, and it showed historic bracelets made by Clinkets and Haidas with the totemic designs engraved.
Mm-hmm.
And luckily I had a friend that was a teacher's assistant to Bill Holm, and he was already doing these things. His name is Steve Brown, and he became an important artifact restorer and professor and ethnography of Northwest Coast Indians also. And I borrowed he was already doing engraving with Northwest Coast Designs, and I borrowed his tools for a weekend, and I made my own copying his. And it wasn't long before I was able to engrave things. And then I got introduced to professional tools, and all of a sudden the quality and the volume of work took a big leap, and I started getting pretty successful doing that.
And you'd sign them what, like with your name, Terry?
Yeah, yeah, Terry Williams.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Is there a market, specifically for your work out there? Have you seen it come out in the resale market and
There's
that kind of thing?
people that used to come in my shop in Alaska and say, I have one of your bracelets.
Uh-huh.
You're famous. And I go, well, I don't know about that, but that's nice you have one of my bracelets. Now I've slowed down. I would like to collect my work back. And that seems to happen to artists a lot where Bill Holm, for example, he's considered the foremost authority on Northwest Coast Indian art. He did his own artwork early in his career, and then he quit. I think maybe somebody asked him to quit because he was so good. And he went around trying to collect his work back.
Mm-hmm.
So I was lucky enough to get to know him and meet him. And he was one of my mentors. But Steve Brown is still one of my major mentors. He's our age. He's a young guy. But he got
That doesn't
interested.
compute. He's a young guy. He's our age.
Well, yeah, he started as a young guy. Bill Holm was a really special guy. He loved sharing information. It was really lucky he discovered Northwest Indian art because he had such an analytical mind. He was able to rediscover the design rules that totemic art was designed and made by in the 19th century. Because of cultural disintegration, largely because of missionaries and other people that came and changed their lifestyles so radically, forbid them from doing traditional art or speaking their language. That sort of artwork was almost gone.
Mm.
And because of Bill Holm and the books he wrote and the native artists that studied with him, caused a renaissance, and it was in full bloom by the 70s when I started getting interested. And it was really a wonderful ride. We were encouraged by everybody, including the natives, to do our artwork. They could see that there was something really exciting going on.
And so this is kind of mid to late 70s that you moved back out from the boonies?
Still in the boonies, but only a couple hours drive from Seattle. And
Yeah.
Steve Brown, he was one of the first guys to carve seagoing canoes, copied from museum examples. And he's now probably carved more of them than any living artist. He got hired by a native tribe at Nia Bay called, let's see, they're way at the north west corner of the Olympic Peninsula. He got hired by them to carve a canoe there. And then he got hired by them to teach their kids to carve canoes. And then he went to Alaska and carved canoes, and he trained some professional carvers that are still carving canoes, and it became a renaissance in seagoing boats.
And these were made to be
Traditional
used?
boats. Yeah, they're using them now. They have canoe get-togethers where guys paddle all the way from Alaska to Seattle to meet other canoe makers
Oh, that's
and
interesting.
hang out with them. So it's a real renaissance, important part of their culture, because that's how they made their living, trading with canoes. And
Originally, yeah.
yeah.
And so what was your next transformation once you get out of living in the cabin and you're raising kids? What were you doing? Have you started buying and selling Indian artifacts at this point?
A little bit, but a huge thing happened. One of my best friends, who was a scrimshander that I met at the public market, his name was David Present. He came from New England, and he learned how to do scrimshaw from copying scrimshaw from the whalers from the old days.
Mm-hmm.
He came to my house with one of his friends, and Seattle kind of hit the skids when Boeing laid off like tens of thousands of employees. They had a bad downturn, and all of a sudden, all the Boeing engineers were doing arts and crafts and selling them at the street fairs. And
Right.
us kids were like competing with, professional engineers that were making really cool and tricky things at
Right.
the street fairs. And David, he he did very well as a scrimshander. He commissioned me to collaborate on some things, and I made silver pieces to accommodate as scrimshaw
Yeah, to
pieces.
attach to them or to ornate
Yeah,
them.
yeah, and he had a solo show of that stuff, and it sold out like in one day.
Mm.
And he goes, "Oh, this is exciting. We need to do this some more." And because of the how competitive the arts and crafts industry in Seattle was, he took a ferry ride to Alaska, and he stopped at every town. In those days, you could get off the ferry and stay as long as you wanted, and then catch the next one. So he spent the summer going town to town investigating the tourism industry and the art business. And he came back and he goes, I found this town. There's almost nobody there, and there's these cruise ships coming and bringing hundreds of people. Now there's tens of thousands of people
Mm-hmm.
coming, but in those days, he recognized it as a land of opportunity and a real business opportunity. He said, "I want you to come." He said, "I rented a shop, and I want you to come and be the resident artist for my shop."
This
So
is in Skagway?
it's in Skagway, Alaska. And he said, my shop, it's right between the two biggest hotels, and we're going to get a lot of traffic, and you're going to do really well. And I said, well, Carl, I'm really busy, and I really enjoy my life on Whidbey Island. And I wasn't convinced. And then he, he worked on me some more, and he talked me into going. And he was a little frustrated because I didn't want to come at the beginning of the season. I had a big garden. I just planted a half-acre garden and
Mm-hmm.
wanted to see the garden through. So I came in mid-August, which is really the end of the tourist season in those days. Now it goes until the end of September, but I only had like 2 weeks of tourist season left. And I brought like 2-year production of silverwork. And I thought, this should be a good test. See if I can make a go of this. And he got real excited. He put my work in the front cabinet. As you walk in the door, you walk right into the cabinet with my work in it. And we sold out of 2 years of production in one weekend.
Come on.
I go, whoa, I was living on $1,500 a year on Whidbey Island. And all of a sudden I made twice that in one weekend. And I go, I think I have a new home now. It took a while to talk my wife into coming up there the next year. And
I'm sure.
we moved up there, and it was a primitive lifestyle, but very successful financially.
When you say primitive, was it like the cabin you lived in without running water?
It was one step up. We had running water.
Yeah.
But it was pretty small, and we were in what was the suburbs then. We were really in the woods, which
Yeah.
was at 15th. Now it's about Midtown because Skagway's become major destination.
So when you go there, what year was that?
That was in 84.
And so your kids are kind of middle school?
Yeah, they were grade school and middle school, yeah.
How did they do there? Because that's a whole different environment, right?
Yeah, what we did there was not unlike Whidbey Island, except that there was no town to go to a couple hours away, so we didn't have the contact with our families and shopping opportunities. And the nice thing about Whidbey Island, you could go to Seattle on a ferry boat and have access to anything you could dream of. But when we moved to Skagway, we were really, at the end of the earth. We used to consider it a joke when people would come off the cruise ship and say, what would your kids do and where would they go to school if you lived in the outback? And my answer always was, well, if this isn't the outback, I don't want to know where it is. So it was pretty primitive.
Would you stay the whole year, or would you just do the summer and then escape back down?
I figured out by the middle of September I wasn't a winter Alaskan resident, and we would go down to Seattle in the winter.
So the kids would go back to school there then?
Yeah, they started school one year, and we realized the quality of the schools weren't up to our standards.
Yeah.
That was around the same time that we discovered Tucson.
Hmm.
So we started spending winters in Tucson not soon after we discovered Alaska. So I've been coming as a snowbird here, and
That was the 80s?
yeah, late '80s, and my kids were lucky enough. I found out from a native artist's wife that you could get in a program called Gifted and Talented Education. And my kids got in that program and they became overachievers, uh, even beyond my wildest dreams. And they've done really well. So my son is now a railroad engineer in Skagway, which is kind of the top of the pecking order in the small town that's based on historic rail.
Mm-hmm.
And my daughter now designs websites for Stanford University.
Do they like Indian art?
They love Indian art, especially my son. He figured out in recent years that he better start collecting some of my things and some of the things I was interested in. And he's getting a collection of his own of both my artwork and his mother's artwork. And my daughter being interested in the internet and education and computers and stuff, hasn't really collected too much physical art, but she's real interested in the future of electronics and computers and the internet. So she's kind of gone on her own,
Yeah.
way
We'll get her.
beyond my wildest dreams.
So you're up there in the 80s in
Yeah.
Skagway, and you come up for every summer, and you're making your own. You're working with this guy in his store, right?
Yeah.
And you're making your own silversmith, right? You're doing your own silver stuff,
Right. Right.
And then at some point, you must get your own store, and or something changes, and you also start dealing in native arts. When was
Yes.
that, and what was that all about?
Yeah, this is a fun story because about 3 years in, we realized David, the gallery owner, he had about a dozen resident artists by then. He was doing really well, and he was descended from a diamond family from Rochester, New York, and his father used to come and say, "Oh, you guys are doing really well." And I said, "Oh, thank you." And he said, "Yeah, and you even have growth." And I didn't even know what that meant, but he meant economically. He could
Right.
see we were growing leaps and bounds.
Right.
And one of the other artists, he was an ivory jewelry artist named Jim Hopkins. He, at the end of the third season, he came over. He said, "By the way, there's this little shop a couple blocks up the street. I just got offered it by the landlady because Princess Tours had their office in there and they never paid their rent. So the biggest companies, they could get away with
Right.
postponing payments and stuff because the town was so isolated. There was no recourse if that ever happened. So anyway, he said, "You want to share that shop?" And I went to look at it, and we decided the same day that we were taking that shop. And David and his wife were somewhat aggravated with us, but we opened our own shop. And I was already collecting native art, and I had a history of it in my family, and I found it really fascinating. For some odd reason, I think it's because in the early days, the gold mining towns and the gold rush towns didn't have very many native people. My theory is when the stampeders came to southeast Alaska, the natives headed for the hills. And it's fascinating that some of the clans, the Tlingit clans, like for instance, the Killerwell clan, we call them Ducklawady, they have more members in the Yukon than they do on the coast because they said, "Whoa, these guys are crazy. Let's get out of here." And there wasn't too many native people in Skagway when I started getting interested in opening my shop. And I had one of the first native art shops we have tourists coming by the boatload, interested in collecting things from Alaska. And I had one of the first shops selling native art, and some native elders came in and they said, "Oh, wow, so you're going to teach us about our culture, huh?" And I said, "Well, you might be surprised." And they decided they liked me after a couple of weeks. And some of the really important ones started coming in and giving me advice and introducing me to their uncles and professional artists from their community. And I became a real success story right away within months of opening my shop. And one of the things I miss the most about having a shop is on the weekends when elders used to come in and bring their things. They would drive all the way from Whitehorse in the Yukon to sell me some artwork and then have halibut fish and chips at the local restaurant. So their whole mission was just to raise enough money to pay for the gas and have lunch. And I could make them happy every weekend. And I miss when they used to come in and sell me their artwork.
And what kind of artwork is this?
Well, the women, Native Alaskan artwork is real gender related mostly. And the women did primarily hide work with bead sewing.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of costumes. The interior people, even in historic times, were famous for doing the costumes and the regalia.
Would these be out of seal skins and things like that, or
they use mostly hometown moose.
Moose.
Yeah, the people in the interior. The people on the coast did marine mammals.
Mm-hmm.
And they brought me things. And then the men mostly did wood carving. Some of them were silversmiths.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly that was, it took a lot of work to learn how to do those bracelets like Bill Reed and Robert Davidson did. So they mostly carved masks and other regalia.
And were you dealing in older material too at this point in time? Were you getting any of that, or was it all contemporary native?
Sometimes we were offered historic things, and that was always really exciting. And they knew that we would show the things respect. Sometimes it was because they had reached a difficult point and they needed to raise money, and sometimes it was stuff they inherited. Traditionally, in the 19th century, the material culture, which was 99% wood objects, were left on the graves to disintegrate.
Mm-hmm.
But when they started finding out that their things were worth thousands of dollars, they started bringing them around more, and they really liked that I would show them respect and pay them a fair price, because most of the traders in the small towns in Alaska could pretty easily take advantage of them, because most of the people didn't realize how valuable their family objects were.
And they had no outlet either, and there was no internet.
Yeah. So within a few years, there was quite a few people that were trying to sell Indian art in Skagway. And now it's gotten to the point where the diamond merchandisers that followed the cruise ship industry have mostly taken over the town, and the local shops can't afford the leases. So there's not too many local shops anymore.
Do you still have yours?
No, I retired from retail when my rent went from $17,000 a year to $125,000 a year.
Oh my God!
For a small shop that was previously a barber shop.
And how much was it when you first started?
$17,000 a year for
when you
shop.
very first started.
Yeah, and
so it was still kind of expensive even then. When you first started back in the 80s, it was $17,000.
Yeah, for a shack, it was pretty expensive. But now I wish I would have bought it. I could have bought it for $25,000 or something, and now it's worth $100,000 or something.
Yeah.
So
you have this shop. You open it is it in the late 80s that when your shop, you and this other guy?
Yeah, just after the mid 80s, and it became really successful by the late 80s and the early 90s.
And did he stay as a partner the whole time?
Yeah, he was an interesting guy, because he was one of those people that really liked starting things and getting them going and then moving on and starting something else. Well, he saw that my native art business was clearly going to take over
Shop.
the shop and the space. And I don't think he was discouraged, but he decided that he was tired of watching me make more money than him.
Yeah.
And he went to Juneau and he opened a big gallery in Juneau, and he became real successful down there. So that often happened because the small towns really had a finite opportunity. And if you really wanted to do good, you could go to a big town that had 10 times as many boats or 10 times as many visitors. And he opened a shop, not unlike ours, but a lot bigger with a lot wider variety of things. And he became really good. And after about 3 years, he sold that. So he's been starting things and selling them and starting things and selling them. And he became eventually very successful. And he recently retired and bought a home on the water near Bellingham, Washington. But I think he's getting bored there already. He's not really well suited
was
for
his name again?
retirement. Jim Hopkins.
Jim Hopkins. And he was dealing, and so he started dealing in Native American art as well.
Yeah, he learned the ropes from me and went off and did his own version.
Yes.
So,
And so you're in Skagway and you're selling contemporary and historic material when they bring it in. Now, there's a whole group of Native artists that collect these ivory pieces that are, 1,000-year-old, 500-year-old. Tell me a little bit about that business and what's gone on with that and how that's changed dramatically.
maybe I can explain it from my experience, because I never imagined when I went there that I was going to become a major Eskimo trader. But a friend of mine who used to come to Skagway to sell raw materials to carvers and artists. He was a retired fish and game agent, and he knew where to go in every corner of Alaska and collect the raw materials. And he had a small plane, like a Piper Cub with giant tires, and he could land on gravel bars. And he knew where he could go land on the north slope on gravel bars, and where he said that some percentage of the rocks and gravel on these gravel bars were fossils from the Ice Age. And he had quite a bit of raw material, and we got really into working with that stuff, and that became even more important than the silver work, both for my previous boss and myself. And Jim Hopkins, he made beads and jewelry out of it.
Would this be like mastodon tusks?
Primarily mammoth and mastodon. About 90% of the remains are mammoth and about 10% are mastodon. But we use the name interchangeably. We didn't know the difference.
What is the difference?
Mastodons are earlier and their tusks are shaped a little different, and they have a tighter grain, and it's real desirable now because it's has more stability than mammoth. Mammoth tends to dry out and crack and fall apart after you get it out of the river or out of the ground. So we really like mastodon, but it's hard to get.
And how old are these tusks?
10 to 20,000 years old.
And they have a brown hue to them at this point.
Sometimes it depends what they laid in. Sometimes they were frozen in the permafrost and they didn't get mineralized very much. And I've actually seen some that looks almost like elephant ivory, which leads to some confusion because obviously customers off the cruise ships can't tell the difference. But a lot of it is heavily mineralized, and our favorite was the most colorful. And the most exotic was the ones that were chocolate colored with blue highlights, because there's a mineral called vivianite. We used to think it was a copper mineral that colored the mammoth ivory blue. And it was actually an iron mineral. I looked it up in Dana's gemological dictionary, and I found out it was an iron mineral that causes mammoth ivory and other fossils from the permafrost to stain blue. There's a real famous example of a Ice Age bison at the University of Alaska called Blue Babe, where a whole mummified bison turned blue. And it's something that fossil collectors like to go and get excited about. It's unbelievable to see something like that. But we started finding sources and locations for the most exotic colors. And then that was really nice for making jewelry.
Mm-hmm.
Chocolate and blue ivory naturally.
So this guy would go find it. He
mineralized.
was an ex-game fishing game, and he would get the material, and you would give it to the artist or sell it to the artist or trade it.
We did a lot of our own, and we sold and traded it. And then a real huge breakthrough happened for me. He was getting ready to retire from that business. We thought that for our whole career, we thought we were going to run out of this stuff in a couple of years. And I used to worry about that. Now that we've invented this industry working with this stuff, that we were going to run out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to visit him at his home in Fairbanks, Alaska, and he said, "Oh, don't worry about that." And he took me out in the backyard and he opened this tool shed. It's like a tough shed in the backyard. And he opened the door and it looked like it was full of cordwood. And all of a sudden I realized the whole thing was completely full of mammoth tusks cut up into chunks a couple feet long. And then I quit worrying about running out of ivory. And I bought a bunch from him, and I encouraged him to bring more to Skagway. And we kind of started a whole generation of younger people that were like our kids' age working on that stuff. And some of them have become real successful. But a really big deal happened when he invited me to visit St. Lawrence Island, which is this big island in the middle of the Bering Straits,
Mm-hmm.
Closer to Russia than to Alaska, and you fly there via Nome. And there was two villages there, and they had nothing to do except for hunt and fish and carve things. And they had access to their version of fossil materials, which was mostly fossil marine mammal materials and fossil walrus ivory, but also Ice Age materials. And they were already national class artists from doing this stuff. There was only a couple of guys that even knew about them, and they were becoming very successful marketing their work to the same sort of galleries that were marketing soapstone sculpture from Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And they were really excited when we came because Roland, the retired fish and game agent, he said, "Now you don't even want to go to this island if you don't bring $10,000 to buy stuff, because when you run out of money, they're going to get really frustrated and angry with you and run you off." And so I came with $10,000 and he came with $10,000, and we spent all our money in less than 2 days and got on the next plane out of Dodge because they really count on you helping everybody. And that grew. Roland retired from that business. He retired. He had a state retirement, and he lived comfortably. He did it mostly as a hobby, and I started going a couple times a year. And we got to the point where we were spending $50,000 per trip, and everybody was really excited when we would show up, and they would really treat us like family.
And you were buying all the carvings that they were doing?
Yeah, at that point, we were buying everything they brought, which they really liked. It didn't matter if it was some broken thing their kid made. I just bought everything.
Yes.
And then there was a point where it became too much. I had to start editorializing and giving them advice and stuff. And that was a little more difficult because they liked it better when we just bought anything they brought in. It was a really good run, and I got really well known for that, both in the native community and in the art business. I was able to generate enough artwork from them to supply other shops.
And were they also bringing in early Bering Straits type of material that they were finding?
Yeah, they figured out early on that the things that they could dig up in their yard were worth a lot more than the raw material.
Mm-hmm.
They could make thousands of dollars digging up old tusks, but they started finding out that old Bering Sea culture artifacts and stuff were selling in New York. Jeffrey Myers was one of the guys that pioneered that industry. he would fly out to those villages, not even get out of the plane, and just wait for them to bring him some things. And he would pay tens of thousands of dollars for old Bering Sea culture dolls and engraved artifacts and
And there was no
stuff.
and there's no regulation or problem doing this, right, for them.
Anything that they dug up on their private land was theirs, and they could do what they wanted with it. And they're grandfathered into the Marine Mammal Act, so they could work with fresh materials too. And they can't sell the fresh materials in the raw, but if they do traditional crafts out of it, they could market the crafts. So that was one of the reasons they had so much artwork for sale, because their lifestyle is living on hunting and fishing,
Hmm.
and the only things they have to hunt are marine mammals, with one exception. They brought some reindeer from Siberia, and they have a herd of reindeer, so they have a few antlers to carve,
Hmm.
and they hunt reindeer in the winter when the marine mammals are are, are frozen out from being able to come to their area.
So how has this changed now with this? Because the laws have changed recently to really kind of outlaw all ivory, including marine ivory, right?
Yeah, the interesting thing is that not too many people, including the powers that be, really understand the regulations. They're real complicated, and you almost have to be a scholar of the fossils and the native culture to understand how it works. But natives can still sell things they make themselves, but it's becoming almost impossible to trade in the raw materials. And a big thing happened a few years ago when a federal act was enacted called the Paleontological Resources Protection Act. And it suddenly became illegal for anybody to collect any fossils from federal lands for any reason, even education. And that was horrible for the non-natives that were trading in the material. But it was tough for the natives too, because suddenly they had to be able to prove where they found the material, because 90% of Alaska is owned by the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the villages are adjacent national parks, and the feds wanted to know if they were collecting artifacts in national parks, and in some cases people were. So there was people that were taking advantage of their right to trade in things, to dig and collect things anywhere they wanted. St. Lawrence Island became known by fish and wildlife and people in the industry as being really the only safe place to buy and trade, because it's an interesting history, because when the U.S. government decided they wanted to build the pipeline for the oil industry,
Mm-hmm.
they did a native land claim settlement. But the Eskimos in the Bering Sea, they didn't really benefit from that. And they said, well, we don't want to sign this thing. You know, every time we sign something, you guys cause trouble for us. And they never signed the land claim settlement. So their tribal government privately owns their island. And so the feds know that the things that come from there are really the only legal source. But it became, as the pressure mounted on gaining control over the fossils from Alaska, and they became illegal from almost any other location, it became really difficult for the natives to prove where they were getting their things. So now they're under enormous pressure. And some agents followed me there, and they got in the business of causing trouble for all those guys. So it's gotten to the point now where the native carvers that work in ivory and bone are having a hard time pursuing their market because nobody really knows what the rules are, including as we talked about the other day, the law enforcement doesn't really know the regulations and don't really care. They're just trying to shut it down.
And they've done that, I assume.
Yeah, it's really close to being over, and it's sad. Uh, they can still sell the one thing they can do really well at. They can still sell the excavated artifacts,
Mm.
but because of the demand in New York, and another thing that really affected the trade for them was when internet came to the most remote corners of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And they all have email in their homes and at their school, and they can see the prices of
Right.
Akvik dolls in New York at the auctions. And now when you go and visit them and they have these beautiful 1,000-year-old artifacts for sale, it's like used to be able to say, well, how much do you want for this? And they'd say, oh, $300-400 or something, and you knew that you could pay their asking price and there wasn't going to be a problem to at least get your money back. Well, now if you ask them about a bear effigy or a Akvik doll, well, that's really a beautiful artifact you found. How much do you want for that? Oh, 30,000 or 50,000. They're very optimistic at what they might bring. So it's really hard to even pay for the flight to go out there now.
And are they able to sell them themselves? Are they able to make a market by selling it?
Well, they've figured out how to consign to the auctions back east, and there's entrepreneurs in the villages, native entrepreneurs that have figured out how to middle that industry, and they've done quite well for themselves. And I don't know how much of it trickles down, but there's some real successful entrepreneurs in the villages. Jeffrey Myers used to go regularly. He would make a trip just for one item, all the way from New York if it was something he wanted or he had a customer for. So, but yeah, it's gotten more and more difficult, and it's getting difficult for them to sell because there's almost nobody coming out there anymore when they want as much as the auction houses back east.
Yeah, so they can't wholesale it anymore. They have to. Well, they can't wholesale it to a dealer. They're basically wholesaling it to the auction house to sell.
Yeah, they basically made the middlemen obsolete, and
Mm-hmm.
I only go just to visit family, friends, and stuff now.
And with all the changes in the laws with ivory, has that market as well, price wise, gone down?
It leveled off, and they're collecting less because they're having a harder time selling it because there's fewer people coming out and buying it from them.
Mm-hmm.
There was a point when there might have been 50 entrepreneurs coming every summer buying everything they could get their hands on.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened was now they're down to only 2 or 3 guys. I was one of the last guys, one of the biggest guys who actually started that industry he worked for state roads
Mm-hmm.
department, and he was all over the state. He realized there was opportunity for a middleman. He kind of pioneered that industry, going to the villages and buying these raw materials. So he just got harassed enough by the feds to not go. It's the first time in the 40 years I've known him that he didn't actually go and buy this year,
Mm-hmm.
because they're putting the screws to him now too.
Yeah, they just want the complete stop of selling this material.
That's right. Their mission is to totally shut it down. They don't seem to be at all concerned about the welfare of the native people, and the native people are really at risk now, and I worry about them. Even the native corporation owns the grocery stores in the villages, and there's times when they don't do enough business to even be able to stock. I've been on St. Lawrence Island when the only thing in the grocery store was diapers and cigarettes and stuff like that. So they've had to go back to hunting and fishing primarily for their livelihood. And as we were talking about the other day, I actually worry a lot about the young people, because they see what young people do in the rest of the world on the internet, and they want to move to the city and wear spandex and go to the disco. And very few of them have learned traditional hunting and gathering or food preparation. And
Mm-hmm.
it's the same problem in Southeast Alaska where the Tlinkits and the Haidas live, where very few people are learning traditional hunting and gathering and food preparation. The really wonderful thing about the Tlinkits and Haidas is they were good entrepreneurs from way back all the way to the fur trade.
Mm-hmm.
They middled the fur trade and they learned how to be businessmen. And they saw this coming, and their native corporations who have been real successful by middling the fishing industry and the logging industry, they have very deep pockets. They now have what we call Indian children culture camps. And the grandparents who grew up at a time when they lived traditional lifestyle and hunted and fished are teaching the grandkids how to hunt and fish and prepare traditional
Mm-hmm.
native food. There's a whole generation in the middle that were the ones that were forbidden from speaking the language or doing their traditional material culture.
Right. A
Uh,
lot of those probably went to Indian schools too.
yeah, and in the good thing was is they did have lawyers and doctors and stuff that learn, you know, modern lifestyle by going to schools in other parts of the country. There's some really great examples of early lawyers and early matriarchs that went away to Indian school in Bellingham and Washington State and other places that came back and were able to help the family businesses and the tribal businesses become very successful.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, the Eskimo corporations that were set up at the time of the land claim settlements, they didn't have those skills, and their tribal corporations failed within a generation. But some of the successful ones are really successful. Good example of Sea Alaska Corporation, Tlingit Haida. They've invested in the cruise ships. They own the best hotels, and it's not uncommon to see them in line at the bank. Whereas a lot of the native people from the remote areas, they can't even take a check because they don't know what to do with it.
Mm.
So
So it's a real dual system.
yeah, some people have thrived, but a lot of people in the remote areas, and there's thousands of what we call Eskimo villages. They're Inuit and Yupik villages where they don't have access to financial institutions, and they're lucky if they can cash a check at the grocery store.
Do they have internet up in those areas?
They do. All of them have internet now. And they're starting to figure it out. I just recently bought an artifact on the internet from a native kid who found a beautiful harpoon head by PayPal.
Yeah.
He figured out about PayPal. He got paid like in 30 seconds, and then he mailed me the thing. So
Yeah.
I'm waiting excitedly to see what he found.
Yeah, but you do see a change with the natives' culture just because they can't deal effectively with any of these materials. They can't get the material, or if they can, it's hard to prove it is. And do you see that maybe literally going away?
Yes, I think I mentioned it briefly in the past, but what I'm really worried about is the people that live in the remote villages are moving to the cities. They're not well educated for having jobs in Western society. A lot of the kids are turning into street people. There's statistics that really give you an idea how critical it is. Native Alaskans have something like 2 or 3 times the the suicide rate of any other kids in the country. And they're kind of lost. And I see these kids I knew in the villages, I see them on streets in the city living as homeless street people and begging. And I, we used to go around and when they were begging and say, if you want to go home, I'll buy your ticket to go home. And one time I even had to send the mayor of Gamble home because he stayed in the bar too long and drank up all his money, couldn't afford to fly home. But yeah, there's a whole generation of kids that don't know traditional lifestyle and are really struggling in the cities, and they're going to be the next generation of homeless people. I can imagine a time not so far in the future when the elders are gone, when that culture is really gone as we know it. It's
Is there any way to stop that? Is there any?
Well, I try in my own little way to encourage them and to buy things from them. I don't really know what it's going to take on the big picture. Probably it's going to take government intervention. They're starting to get more funding for medical clinics and facilities in the villages because until recently they had to fly to Nome even for medical care. It's funny, the government will give them their ticket to go to the hospital and they'll give them a ticket to come home from the hospital. But if they miss their flight, they're on their own. So often what happens, that's what happened to the mayor, I think, went to the hospital, he went to the bar, drinking some beer, missed his flight, and then he got stuck there. He was stuck there for days. And I bought him a ticket to get home. That really paid off for me because I got stranded the same year I got stranded on their island. And the weather was so bad the planes couldn't fly. And I had just spent my last dollar. And the word got around town that I was out of money and I was stranded there. And there was people that were going, why are you still here and stuff like that. But the mayor came over, he said, you helped me out that time. I really appreciate that. You can stay on our credit at the tribal housing for as long as you have to, and then pay us later.
Yeah.
So he gave me a line of credit with the tribal corporation, and I lived real comfortably. But the people that were selling stuff, they couldn't figure out why I was still hanging around or beach combing. They wanted to see what was in my bag because they were afraid I was picking up ivory.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, that's their livelihood.
Yeah.
And how long did you stay there for that?
I think I got stuck for 3 days. That's the longest I've been stuck. It's a common problem in Alaska to get stuck. I've been stuck in Juneau for 3 days. So. But that was a little hair-raising.
These are little villages, too. There's not many people, right?
A couple hundred people.
Yeah, so everybody knows everybody.
Yeah, they all know me. They know the buyers, of course.
Yes.
We stand out. Even if I wear their clothes, they can recognize me from a mile away.
I'm sure they can.
Yeah.
So you've gone through this life, and you're still interested in native arts, I assume, right? You still deal in it?
I'm fascinated by it. It's a compulsion I'll probably never outgrow, and I'm still collecting things, and I'm marketing less, but I really enjoy it. And I'm trying, it's my mission with the success I've had to try to almost do, I think I mentioned, trying to do philanthropic things to help them. I've sent kids to university, and it's been some real success stories. Some of the kids are brilliant, and they just needed an opportunity.
Sure.
There's a really good example of an Eskimo kid, grew up in Haines, Alaska. His father was a carver, and he was a straight A student. And he was the first native Alaskan to get a full scholarship to Stanford University.
Wow.
And now he works for Google Maps or something and lives happily in Seattle. So.
And if people want to get a hold of you, how do they find you, Terry?
I'm on the internet under Inside Passage Arts, and my biggest buying and selling venue now is at the trade shows here, what we call the Tucson gym shows.
Mm-hmm.
And I've pretty much gotten out of running shops and being readily available to people year round because I'm mostly retired now. But people do bring me really cool stuff to the gym shows.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd be surprised, people come all the way from Alaska to sell us stuff.
Yeah, in Tucson.
Yeah, and Alaska Airlines has been a real good thing for them because you can get on a plane in Anchorage and fly all the way to Tucson.
Direct?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Well, you have to, they stop in Seattle because
Yeah.
that's their hub.
Yeah.
But yeah, I encourage them to come down. I've put them up when they come and visit us. I had a native girl stay with us for a month. She almost forgot to go home. She liked Tucson so much she wanted to bring her parents down
Yeah.
here.
Well,
It's pretty good weather compared to Alaska in the winter.
yeah, I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
Well, Terry, it's been great having you on. And people, I encourage you, if you're out of the Gem and Mineral Show, go look for Terry.
Thank you.
And or online at his website.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed working with you, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, it's just getting to find out the backstory is always so interesting to me. I mean, I know you 40 years, but
Yeah.
you don't know. The problem is we don't take the time in our
Yeah.
busy lives to sit down and talk to other people.
Yeah.
And ask the questions. How did you get where you got, and why? And to me, that's always the most interesting part of doing it. And one of the reasons I do these podcasts is so I can force myself, if nothing else, to take the time to really understand my own community.
It's really exciting that we're at the stage of our careers where we can start to investigate the background stories and in my case, I'm studying the culture. I was always into the material culture. Now I'm starting to realize how important the belief system is, and now
The
I've
people.
been adopted by Native family, and I'm learning more about that. I'm trying to contribute in my own way.
Yeah, good for you. We'll
Yeah.
keep doing it, Terry.
Thank you very much.
Terry Williams, thank you very much.
My
Nice to see you.
pleasure,
All right.
Mark. It's great to see
right.
you.
Terry Williams, Art Dealer Diaries.
Thank you.
That was fun.
Yeah, it's fun to tell the story. I love talking about it.
We need your support for the Medicine Man Gallery channel, so make sure to click the subscribe button and tap the little bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video, which we do every morning on Wednesday and Friday. See you soon.